There is a long-standing distinction in Western philosophy between a life that is characterized primarily by contemplation, on the one hand, and a life that is characterized primarily by action or activity, on the other hand. At first, it may not be obvious what differentiates lives of these kinds. Some philosophers have thought that a life that is characterized primarily by contemplation is very different from the kind of life that is characterized primarily by action. One philosopher who appears to think this, though it's not entirely clear, is Aristotle. In Book 10 of his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle suggests that the life of contemplation is not only quite different from the life of activity, a life that he characterizes as a political life, but is in fact superior to a life of activity. Aristotle appears to think this because he suggests that a life that is devoted to reflecting on those things most worthy of reflection is superior to the kind of life that involves simply working with the things of this world, many of which are not especially worthy of reflection. Aristotle predominantly has in mind God when he's thinking about these objects of reflection, and for Aristotle, it appears that he's arguing that human persons are divine, they are at their best, they are their most transcendent when they're reflecting on God. And so Aristotle thinks a life that is characterized by a kind of static reflection, a continual and circular sort of reflection on the divine, is going to be a life that is superior to a life of activity. Many other philosophers after Aristotle, including St. Thomas Aquinas, took up this distinction and developed it in their own ways. However, it may be the case that this hard distinction between, on the one hand, a life primarily characterized by contemplation and a life primarily characterized by activity is not the right kind of distinction to begin with. One way of thinking about the difference between the contemplative life and the life of activity, or the active life, is in this stark way, the way that Aristotle thinks about it. But there's another way we might think about the contemplative life, and it doesn't set the contemplative life so much at odds with the active life. In Plato's Apology, Socrates says famously that the unexamined life is not worth living. That gives us a kind of hint as to how we might think about the contemplative life. If Socrates is right, then the examined life is not necessarily a life that is a life sitting around contemplating particular objects in a kind of static or circular way. Instead, it could be the kind of life that involves various kinds of activity, even the kind of political activity that Aristotle characterizes as associated with the active life. Instead, the examined life involves contemplation in the sense that it involves reflection. For Socrates, the examined life is a life in which a person acts, but in acting, reflects and thinks about what he or she is doing. The objects of reflection are not necessarily special objects, as the objects of reflection appear to be for Aristotle. Instead, Socrates is supposing that any human activity can be examined. Any human activity can be the appropriate object of reflection. And in reflecting on these activities, we can come to appreciate what it is to live well as human persons.